Hello, hello. Welcome to the end of the day session. Glad to see you all here. This is Jumpstart Your Drupal Projects with Recipes. I am Mark Mayon. I'm the Managing Director of Tech at Forum One. I've been doing web stuff for 17 years, which scares me every time I mention it. And
I am Olu Adeyanju. I'm a technical architect at Forum One. I've been with Forum One for about 5 years, and I've been working with Drupal for 14.
we are Forum One. We work with NGOs, nonprofits, state and local governments, and the federal government, working with folks that want to make an impact in the world. And talk to me if you want to hear some more about that. Today, we're obviously here to talk about recipes. So we're going to cover what a recipe is, why we use recipes, what creating a recipe looks like, what our technical approach to recipes are, and a little bit of a technical deep dive, and then we'll hear from you. So what is a recipe? As some of us know, recipes were born from the Starshot Initiative, and it's a one-way configuration import that allows you in a flexible way to enable a feature via a recipe. What I like to think of recipes as is kind of like an organizational chart. I think that's one of its powers, is a singular recipe can reach out to other recipes, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, and import all sorts of configuration and good stuff. I do want to throw out a warning that mentioning Starshot comes with its own issues, which means that they're ready to break things quickly, and so while I and Olu haven't personally seen a ton of like breaking changes happening in recipes, I would also not find it totally unexpected. So why recipes? I think that allowing more people to access more features in an easier, lower barrier of entry makes it so that people can create more robust websites in an easier way. I think that as you progress through your life cycle of owning your web property, you're going to need more and varied features, and being able to do that throughout the life cycle rather than have to think about everything on day one is really nice. So you can choose, you can cherry pick whichever things work for you at any given time. We also use it to make our lives easier when we're starting a project. So whether it be headless, which Olu is going to be talking about a little bit later, or a standard build, having different ways to start your project provides more value for our clients. We also, as we mentioned, some of the clients that we work with, they have pretty standard security postures. So being able to work with a client and grow their portfolio of sites, or within a particular department or what have you, it's a way to stand things up pretty quick in a compliant manner with however they operate. So to that end, who do I think could benefit from some of these recipe goodness? I think academia is a place that I foresee it being rolled into. Lots of departments or schools within a university needing to stand up various web properties, and doing so in a standardized way is really nice. As I already mentioned, we work with a lot of state and local governments and the federal government, and so being able to stand up something quickly with recipes, or have standard features that integrate with like Gov delivery or what have you, is going to make things really easy. And then for us at Forum One in the digital agency space, we have a smattering of logos here with, for instance, museums. We work with a lot of museums, and we can walk up to them and say, hey, we're going to be able to hit the ground running. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what creating a recipe looks like and what the anatomy of an actual file is. Right now, you have to create recipes by hand. It's a little onerous, but as you can either leverage ChatGPT or write it in yourself in an IDE. And I think the reason for this is, if you're familiar with a config export, it captures the entire state of a site. It's hard to tell Drupal, I only want this select few things, and to export it into a file. And so it's just kind of the way it is at the moment. So what does that look like? At the top, we have the kind of meta information in which you need to fill out what you're trying to achieve. You get a name, a description, and you can fill out a type. You can actually, as I mentioned before in the kind of org chart model, you can define what recipes depend on what dependencies you want to pull in from other recipes. The install chunk is going to talk about the modules dependencies that you want to include. Olu's going to talk about that a little bit more and some of the challenges there. And one of the big powers of recipes, in my opinion, is also the input chunk, where you can define prompts that you want to ask your users as the recipe is enabled. So for instance, if you have like an SSO setup and you need an API key, you can actually ask the user for that information at the point in which you're installing the recipe, which makes configuration a lot easier rather than clicking around in Drupal and trying to find the magical box and et cetera. This is the meat and potatoes, the config chunk of a recipe, where it actually is the config YAML that you're pretty much used to. It's defined on a module by module basis. And Olu is going to be talking a little bit more about that strict flag in the middle of the chunk here. Lastly, we have the ability to import content. Here, we're seeing it done in the YAML file. We're going to hear a little bit more again from Olu a little bit later about some different ways to achieve importing content. But this sets you up with a not sad, empty website whenever you turn the feature on. And this is how you import a recipe. You can either use a drush command, or you can do like a little PHP one-liner. This is also in the documentation, which is here. Look at the documentation. There's a link here to contribute. In the sprint tomorrow, they have highlighted a couple of recipe issues, which include some documentation challenges that they're trying to fix, and please contribute back. And I'm going to turn it over to Olu to talk about our approach.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach. One of the things I'm not going to go too technical. It's really just this high-level overview of where we were before and where we're going now, and some of the challenges that we faced along the way. So before the Recipes Initiative, we wanted a quick starting point for projects. It initially was a command line tool with prompts. Thinking back to this previous iteration of our starter project, what was great about this was, providing prompts and making it clear for developers the different pathways for setup, depending on where the site would be hosted, what theme would be used, and we spend a lot of time maintaining the tool. And that's something that we eventually found undesirable. What we wanted to get away from was this complex infrastructure that we had to maintain, which ultimately distracted us from having a really good starting point for working in Drupal. Then we spent a little bit of time developing a profile that Mark named Whiplash, which could be brought in as a composer dependency. We worked with that profile for a little while, but you also get locked in. The profile itself had some opinions that didn't work for a lot of the projects that had more custom needs. And then we often would be out of sync one way or another with our composer dependencies. Then we settled on a Git repository template that wasn't quite a profile, but still a starting point for our Drupal projects. And we put a lot of our assumptions into that starter template. This was all with the goal of delivering value to our clients. If we're spending less time getting projects started, if we avoid recreating the same components we typically build on all of our projects, we can instead spend more time solving our clients' more complex problems. So we were already on the path to working with recipes with starter kits. So a starter kit as a module itself just contained configuration to be installed. We kept common module dependencies in our composer packages in that module. This ultimately made moving over to recipes fairly straightforward. We first identified core configurations to our template, and we separated that out into its own recipes. Then any additional features were put into their own recipes. Most of that ultimately was about copying and pasting configuration from starter kits to those recipes. Then we would manually write the corresponding YAML files for each recipe. Along the way, we ensure we are properly handling dependencies between recipes and modules. We tested the process of applying each recipe individually to make sure that recipes could be applied cleanly. And then finally, we documented the recipes and their dependencies. Having something built around recipes still allows us to have configuration that is reusable over many projects, while being decoupled from an install profile, And a lot of the features we valued in our homegrown tools also show up when you start to use recipes, like Mark mentioned earlier, the input. We still get a place where we have those prompts. A recipe can be applied at any point in a build or maintenance within the project or product lifecycle. This gives developers a way to apply the recipes when needed and without being locked into predefined structures. We benefit from contributions from the Drupal community, and in turn, we have an easy way to contribute back. There are still challenges, chief among them, that there is still a lot of development around recipes, and there'll still be time for this feature to mature. The configuration is relatively easy to write, as Mark has walked through, but it's still not a silver bullet for getting configurations to work. As with many things, we'll need to maintain the recipes over time and keep growing the recipes along with Drupal as it grows. The configuration, the other problems that we found were around dependency management. It's still a fairly complex problem for us to solve, and we can get into that in a little bit. But first I wanted to talk about some of the groups of recipes that we've put together. When we got through our initial phase of putting together recipes and putting together our base template, we started putting together recipes not just for content types we commonly use, but also for frameworks we typically implement on builds. One of the first things we prioritize were recipes for common hosting providers that we use. When developers get going on work, we want to make sure that they aren't thinking twice about what they need to include when deploying builds to Pantheon, Acquia, or Platform SH. It's important to note that we don't just include the recipe and call it a day, but we also include written documentation so developers know where to trim the repository if needed. In this way, we're still starting with that, starter kit mentality. And this is a starting point for tailoring experiences for our clients. The next common feature we wanted to prioritize was default content. Having representative content while building a project is crucial and ensures developers are building the right components and features with the client's real content in mind. Well, why not do the same for common features that you create for your projects? Leverage the default content module, which recipes does accommodate. Mark showed you one way of incorporating content with recipes. If you're leveraging the default content module, you can also include a folder simply labeled content with the necessary assets from exported content that will now be imported when you apply the corresponding recipes. You'll quickly know when you apply those recipes what you're getting or what you're working with. Form 1 is moving in a headless first direction for reasons that we can save for another talk. All the same, there's a non-trivial amount of requirements for getting started with a headless framework. We're getting together all of the module requirements and their corresponding configuration in recipes so that we take a setup from being about an hour to 5 to 10 minutes. And again, we're making sure we're filling out documentation for the process to make sure we're educating our developers on the process so that they have the necessary context to improve it. And I guess I really can't stress this enough. The documentation really does help all of our developers sort of like get on the same page with where we're at and allows them an opportunity to continue to improve what we're working with. So when we get into the future and we're doing more of these sites, and Drupal is growing, and there are more technologies out there where we have a foundational understanding of what we're building. And it's not just about, spinning up a template, although, that's also something nice. Now, we talked earlier that there are a few gotchas, things that took us aback as we were building out our templates. We have to continue to remind ourselves that iteration is key, and we don't want to let perfection be the enemy of progress. We have to aim to improve our internal tools as time allows us, while bearing in mind the constant changes in the Drupal ecosystem. So getting into specifically challenges that we had, one issue that garnered a fair amount of discussion from our team was what to do about overlapping field configurations. This discussion led us to think about base recipes, common foundational recipes that we would apply before starting on other recipes. Basically, if you have features like paragraphs or content types, should each recipe create its own field configuration? And our opinion is no. We'd like to reuse the configuration as much as possible to, keep overhead on the database pretty low. Something that helped us think through the problem was a diagram like this, mapping out all the fields and lining them up where there were common fields. Another approach would just to keep track of a content model, almost like keeping track of your own internal project. Even with that planning, you'll still likely run into conflicts. Maybe it's with your own recipes, but sometimes you'll run into conflicts with core recipes. One very simple strategy to resolve conflicts is to test in isolation. Hopefully the resolution will be clear to you from going through the steps. Another tool recipes has provided as recently as this last fall is the option to relax strict comparison with existing config. So let's say you have an already applied recipe that included configuration for a field display. You go back and apply another recipe that uses the same field display with some minor changes. What you'll end up getting is an error warning that you already have existing config. If you set the strict flag to false, the configuration from your second recipe will be applied. The general guidance on this is to keep strict true for configuration that affects the layout of items like the database and layouts in the database like field storage. You may be able to apply recipes without conflicts, but it always helps to be prepared in case you do have them. What we found works for us is to make sure to document dependencies in writing with each recipe. Sometimes having that narrative description makes all the difference in avoiding issues. Be thoughtful about the assumptions you make about existing configuration. If you aren't sure, check out the core recipes or other recipes that you've already put together to see what's going on. And perhaps you can more clearly establish a dependency between multiple recipes as a result. As much as possible, keep the recipes discrete. I think some of this is just goes to the principles of development, one principle of development, which is a separation of concerns. One of the trickiest things that we've had to solve for, and I'm not sure that we have, is whether to maintain our recipes all in one place or in multiple repositories. What is great about going with a templated repository approach is that you get to manage all the recipes in one place with all other templated portions of the profile. So if you want to add a new recipe or maintain an existing one, just update the one template. If you want to update the common tooling like ddev or lando commands, just update the template. The problem with this approach is that we couldn't reliably pull in our composer dependencies the way that we wanted to. We initially put together a shell script turned a ddev command that will pull a list of composer dependencies from a text file we called ingredients. And so then what would happen is it would require all those dependencies and then apply the recipe. But then we had to solve for nested dependencies, and that also seemed too cumbersome and potentially fragile to maintain. We then moved to distributed recipes where we have one Git repository for each recipe. You can imagine how cumbersome that might be depending on the amount of recipes you have. One advantage to this, especially if you document the relationship between these recipes, is that dependency management gets a lot easier and it's handled, through Composer. Then all you have to do is make sure to unpack those dependencies using a utility that I'll link to, and then manually bring them into your project Composer file, or manually bring them into your project Composer file. Perhaps somebody in the community has a way that they're doing this that they can share here today that solves, all the challenges that we've, brought to bear here. But, as we were thinking about it, one thought was, having a mono repo. So that way we have a place where all the recipes live, but then they get distributed from their own independent repositories. But we're not quite there yet. So here I'm providing a list of resources. I link out to our Base and Canvas starter kits. Those are public. Base, Canvas, Gesso. A lot of projects we put together for Drupal have this allusion to painting. And then all of this is, just the idea of you're creating something, it's a starting point for creating a masterpiece for your client. We have a specific project template that is still private. It pulls in those Base and Canvas recipes and features all the common, sort of modules, et cetera, that we use to do what we do. I've also included links to the recipes cookbook, developer documentation, and then a lot of resources from Canopy. I think they're doing really good work in this space. And then, again, linking to that unpack utility, and then an example of a headless starter kit from Wonder.io. So before we summarize and take questions, I wanted to thank the folks you see on the screen, Carson, Matt, Lynn, John, KJ, Andrew, Cody, and Corey, and especially Carson, who's been really deeply involved in all of this stuff, and I wish he was here. It definitely takes a team, and I feel very lucky to be working with Mark and all these folks on this. So I'll pass it back to Mark, and we'll get to some questions.
Yeah, so we've talked about what a recipe is, why we use recipes, how to create a recipe on your own, and how we've taken our approach to recipes after using an install profile, and look forward to whatever questions you may have.
What does an update look like to you update a field in a recipe that's already been released? How does that get updated next? And then config management in the already updated one, or are you able to update the recipe and somehow trickle it out to the other sites that have it?
The question is, what happens after you want to iterate on the feature, and what happens to the recipe?
So once you've applied the recipe and you're working with it in that project, what's probably best to do is just track those changes within that project and then feed it back into that global recipe. We're just not in a place where, like reapplying the recipe would be efficient. Yes?
So what version of Drupal supports recipes?
The question is.
The question is what version of Drupal supports recipes? It's 10.3. Yep. Yep.
So, recipes new, I've known about them probably for 2 months or so, and as I'm suggesting it, and maybe I missed something, but the question is, does recipes, or could recipes eventually replace or conflict with install scripts and dependencies there?
So the question is about whether or not install scripts would end up clashing with working with recipes. Is that correct? I don't really think so.
I think there's a session going on at the same time as this one that we kind of about that topic. The distributions are dead along with distributions. So, I think it's going to repeat the.
Yeah. So there's a separate, for the purposes of the recording, there's a separate session going on right now that discusses distributions and the relationship with recipes, and I would recommend taking a look at that session. All right.
Well, go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Do you think it's smart to create a recipe to undo what was done?
The question was, would it be interesting to have a recipe undo something that's already done?
Tell the packers more fleshed out.
I'm not sure if I immediately can think of a use case where you would want to turn something off with a recipe.
Yeah, I can't either. And I mean, my feeling is that, again, like, this is like a starting point, and presumably, like, if you're looking at your, recipes, there's just like a logical flow to them that like keeps you from like undoing something that you've already, put together. I kind of feel like it's more about adding to what you have, and I think that's the way that we've been thinking about it.
One technical question, you mentioned default content as a module to kind of help you with that. I'm assuming you're using something like DCEM. Do you keep those helper YAML files that default content asks you in there?
Yes, and if you take a look at, I'm not 100% sure if it's in the base or the Canvas repositories. We do have it in our sort of internal project template. Sorry, for the purposes of the recording again, the question was whether or not you keep the YAML files produced by default content within the recipe. The short answer is yes.
All the YAML content, and then that one that helps the module itself do the work is there as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, green shirt.
Yeah, so you mentioned having multiple repos, but at least in my opinion, would it be more beneficial to actually have one repo for all recipes and just treat it like a feature branch?
That's the question was, wouldn't it be easier to have a singular repo rather than multiple repositories to manage a set of recipes that a digital agency might have, that we might have? And yeah, we explored that, and Olu talked a little bit about how the issue becomes how you deal with module dependencies, because you can no longer, in an automated way, install module dependencies that the recipe requires, because it's just sitting there. You're not like doing a composer require recipe / whatever. And so that's the challenge, and we kind of like toiled around with how to deal with that, and we were like, well, I guess we should just use recipes in the way they intended, basically. Is that?
Yeah, that's true.
Going once, going twice. Have a nice day.
Thanks.